we hear about especially with the Chinese government, you hear about the stories like there's human rights abuses, there's no free press, it's a dictatorship, one party system, it's a they they silence dissidents, all those sorts of things. And then you have, of course, when the US and the Europe accuse, that's what they accuse China of. And then, of course, China hits back and they say, oh, what about America? You invade other countries illegally. You have the largest mass incarceration rate of more than 2 million. You lock up kids in cages. You are doing this forced birth control thing that you accuse us of. And so that's an argument that they call whataboutism or whataboutery. It's like deflecting the issue when you're being accused. And so that's actually what is going on right now is that the the administration of President Biden already called for a political and diplomatic boycott of to the the Beijing Winter Olympics, which will be held in February of 2022. And so that will give China the excuse, and they will use arguments that the US has this unjustly has police officers that shoot unarmed innocent civilians. They lock up kids in cages at the border. They have the largest mass incarceration rate. They're doing the same forced prison labor that they accuse, you know, the Chinese government what the Chinese government is doing in Xinjiang. So you got all this, narratives. So this is like a repeat of the Olympic boycotts that happened in the 1980s when the US called for a boycott when Russia invaded Afghanistan. And then 4 years later, the Summer Olympics was held in LA. And then accused, they retaliated as a result. And so the Los Angeles Olympics will be held again 6 years from now, almost 6 years from now in 2028. And then when that comes, China might also call for a boycott of the Los Angeles Olympics in that same retaliation that Russia boycotted the LA Olympics in 1984. They'll use arguments like the incarceration, the wars, and the all those stuff. And so that's of course when you hear about like this human rights thing. So let's go to this issue. It's also like similarly when this free Tibet movement almost almost did a boycott or called for a boycott in the 2008 Beijing Olympics because this is almost a repeat of the attempt to boycott the Olympics in Beijing that also happened in 2008 when coincidentally Beijing had the Summer Olympics there in 2008. And that was actually the same move that these activists did when they almost staged a coup in Lhasa, which was the former capital of Tibet when before China invaded Tibet, or whatever you want to call it, liberated. And so they have all the signs like free Tibet, and the question was what was Tibet like before the China invaded Tibet. So I heard all the stories about like it was like this religious utopia out of materialism. And the fact was is that this history that China was this feudal slavery, religious slavery, where 5% of the monks were the rich lamas, and the 95% of Tibetan citizens were the serfs or the slaves. And they had this slavery system where they were very ruthless. If they didn't pay their taxes, they would have their hands, limbs, or cut off, and then they would confiscate their properties. And so that was Tibet before. And this is not being shown in the mainstream Western media. And now Tibet, when it got occupied by communist China, they got rid of that slavery system in which those laws were very harsh, and they helped thrive the Tibetans, even though that Tibetans weren't really free under communist China. Well, whatever you want to name it. And so you have another one like Xinjiang, and Xinjiang is the center for China's Belt and Road Initiative, and that's why the U.S. and other Western countries have like this accusations that China is committing human rights torture, mass incarceration, prison camps in the province of Xinjiang. And this is almost the same narrative that China also accuses the US of, because surprisingly, there's a huge amount of hypocrisy there of the US on Xinjiang, calling on China for its internment in Xinjiang, the province of Xinjiang, and the fact and their roundup of the Muslim Uyghurs, because there were recent attacks in the province of Xinjiang in the early 2010s that were committed by Al Qaeda trained Uyghur separatists. And China uses the excuse that, like, they're they're de-radicalizing the terrorists, they're re-educating them, they're lifting them up and bring them into a new life. And so that's the thing, that the irony is that there are prison camps in the United States that almost does the same kind of prison labor that the US is accusing China of, with the forced cotton and the manufacturing of companies through prison labor. There are stories that the US, the American corporations made in USA companies that are manufacturing in the US, are actually benefited from prison labor. And that's the same thing that the US government accuses the Chinese government of, is that they're using the prison camps of this incarcerated Uyghur Muslims to, produce cotton and produce all the cloth manufacturing. And so there's no justification to that. Both of the countries are very guilty of this. Then you of course there are human rights violations in other Asian countries, but we're not calling out those countries for its human rights violations. Like example, Saudi Arabia. The U.S. has a lot of businesses in Saudi Arabia they conduct with. That's why, even though there are outrage of the human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia, we're not really calling them out. The It just so happens that Qatar will hold its FIFA World Cup soccer competition in next year. the same year that Beijing will hold its Winter Olympics. And of course, the the Qatar government has been accused of, you know, its soccer stadiums was being built through exploitation, and there was barely, or what I say, not a lot of calling out of its human rights abuses, the same thing that, China is being accused of. So there's a lot of hypocrisy right there. And the irony is that all these accusations that, they're doing forced birth control and first forced abortion, it's almost similar, like the same thing that is going on in the prison camps in the United States to its treating its people of color. And of course, you got a religious fanatic named Dr. Adrian Zenz, who works for a US backed organization called the Victims of Communism Memorial, which is a very right wing organization. And he believed that he was chosen by God to destroy the Communist Party of China. And of course, there are left activists who say that the US shouldn't be speaking out, should be speaking of human rights and accuse other countries of human rights while America itself commits human rights abuses. That one is also true. I think that, but I think to say that we Americans should not speak about human rights violations in other countries is just flawed, and it's kind of BS, because no matter what country you're from, whether you're not your country is committing human rights abuses, you can still speak out against its human rights abuses and human rights abuses in other countries. And so that's why, you know, they there are leftists there who say that, like, who look at China as the good guy and look at America as the bad guy because of the media narrative that they're not really calling out a lot of the human rights abuses in the US, while because the thing here, the mainstream narrative in countries like US or Europe is that they single out only China, that China is the only country that commits human rights abuses, while Europe conspires with the US in trying to cover up or ignore its own human rights abuses. And I think it was right that Columbia University economics professor who was featured in the BBC, he called out the BBC for ignoring the UK's and the US human rights abuses, because the BBC is also guilty of ignoring America's human rights abuses while only singling out China as the only world's human rights abuser. And he got them. So I don't think really that democracy, and I agree with some people who say that democracy and human rights do not mix with the Olympics, because Olympics should be a thing of athletes from other countries coming together and compete for one another for friendship. And Olympics is about uniting the countries together, regardless of any government system or political ideologies. So, anyway, the US has a very long history of weaponizing human rights, freedom, and democracy to destabilize other countries that have a better democratic and human right system than in the US. Well, I agree with some d- commentators that say that a human right should be the right to healthcare, the right to live, the right to the right to be insured, the right to have a public transportation more conveniently and efficiently. That is a human right. It's not just some political ballot. It's what we do in everyday lives. It's a human right. And so, yeah, that when you hear about this stuff like freedom and democracy and human rights, just take a look on who's the organization and who funds them, who supports them, who backs them, because that's what's going to come out in the end. So, that's the fact that the US and China accuse each other of of certain human rights abuses. And these countries are no saints when it comes to human rights. And they should come together if they're going to fix some issues, especially minimize tensions or diplomatic tensions.